Hello, hello. Happy Wellness Wednesday. I am so excited to be here. I wanted to be here much earlier, but my little's gym had this guy from America's Got Talent that came to do a magic show for them after practice. So they practiced for 4.5 hours and then they had a magic show after. So it was kind of neat, but meant we were delayed by like 45 minutes. So I put out this feeler on Instagram stories hey, I'm about to do this live on gluten, and it's a topic everybody asks me about. Y'all come check it out. And then an hour later, here I am. So yay for the unexpected, right? So today we're talking about gluten and why gluten is bad for you. We're also talking about if gluten is okay for anyone, because I hear that a lot, right? Before we dive into that, if I'm just popping up in your news feed because somebody shared me, or maybe you're checking this out on the replay on YouTube, I'm Audrey Christie. I'm a holistic wellness practitioner. I help people heal from the roots up and the inside out rather than mask symptoms with prescription medication. Now, does that mean that we don't take prescription medications ever? No. My whole philosophy is a yes and approach. So yes, you might need to take a medication for an acute problem or something that's happening right now, like strep throat. But then we need to figure out, yes, and what other approaches, what other things we can do to fix that. So if you have super high blood pressure and you have to get it down right now, medication might be the answer for now, but it's not the long-term solution. So I work with people on long-term solutions. And today we're talking about gluten because it's a non-negotiable in my practice for the patients that I see, for the clients that I work with. And so we're going to talk about that. So, I'm going to respectfully sound like some of my elders when I say this. But if I honestly had a dime for every time somebody said, gluten doesn't seem to be a problem for me, I'd be sitting on a beach somewhere full flipping time, okay? So let's start out by talking about what exactly is gluten, because that's another challenge that I see when I work with clients and patients on how to get gluten out of their lives. They're like, well, they don't understand necessarily what that is. Gluten technically is a group of proteins, right? It sounds weird, protein found in bread, but it's a group of proteins found in grains, and it makes up about 75 to 85% of the protein content in wheat specifically, but it's also found in all the different species that are related to wheat, hybrids, spelt, einkorn, barley, rye, oats, and any product derived from these things like breads and malts and all of that. And honestly, these days with the way modern food is manufactured, and hopefully you're not buying a lot of manufactured food or food-like substances, but I know I see it in grocery carts all over the grocery store. If you're buying, processed food, or honestly with any kind of modern food manufacturing, you can bet that many things, even things that shouldn't have gluten in them, like shampoo or lunch meat, unless they are specifically labeled as gluten-free, it probably has gluten in it, okay? It's a cheap way to thicken products. So that's what they use it for. They thicken salad dressings and soups and shampoos and conditioners and all of these things, moisturizers. A lot of these things have gluten in them. So the big question is, as an individual, should you avoid gluten? Should I avoid gluten? Should every human on the planet avoid gluten? And the short answer is yes. But generally that's not enough to convince people that they should avoid this inflammatory agent. Even me standing on my soapbox, shouting it from all the platforms, no more gluten, people, I still hear questions and statements like, well, I don't think gluten is a problem for me, or I don't really seem to have issues with gluten, while also inquiring about pain, inflammation, chronic illness, autoimmune disease, fibromyalgia, multiple sclerosis, arthritis, brain fog, ADHD, hormone issues, acne, inability to lose weight, anxiety, psoriasis, allergies, all of these things, chemical sensitivity, seizures, depressions, and any other, symptom or medically unexplained symptom, right? So rather than dive into the physiology and the anatomy about gluten and its exact effect on the cells, I want to look at a little bit bigger picture. So if you guys are hanging out on live or catching the replay, make sure that you can put your questions in the comment box. It'll either come up below or beside, depending on what kind of device that you're working on. And if I don't answer your questions during the live, then I will definitely come back and answer them via text. So again, rather than dive into all the anatomy and physiology, we're going to talk a little bit broader subject. So recently, or sort of recently, in 2015, the most recent study completed on gluten was published from Harvard. And in this study, they took 4 different groups of people, okay? 4 different groups. Group 1, they had people with recently diagnosed celiac disease. So very, very inflamed people. They just found out that they have celiac, right? So that means that their gut is inflamed to the point that it could require surgical intervention, for example. They could end up with a colostomy. So these people are very, very inflamed. In group 2, this was full of people that had officially been diagnosed with celiac disease, but they had put it into remission with at least 1 year of gluten-free diet, right? Group 3 had people with non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So those are people that come to the doctor's office and say, you know, I think wheat is giving me a problem. I'm having these troubles, but they have not necessarily been diagnosed with official celiac disease. And then the final group, group 4, seems to be the people that I meet so often, felt that they didn't have an issue with gluten whatsoever. They felt gluten was fine for them. So they took all 4 of these groups, right? All 4, and they exposed them to something called alpha gliadin, okay? And alpha gliadin is the scientific name for one of the proteins found in gluten. And you might be surprised at what they found. In all 4 groups, every single person, not 50%, not 70%, but in all 4 groups, every single person developed intestinal permeability. And what that means is another word for gut dysbiosis or leaky gut. And they didn't just develop it. It occurred within 5 minutes of exposure. And interestingly, as a side note, I usually talk about animal studies and how they do or do not correlate with humans in whatever case we're talking about on these things. And in this case, this study was done in humans, and it was also duplicated in animals. So think about that when you're buying dog food or cat food or whatever kind of food. You know, we have chicken, so chicken food, whatever you're feeding your animals, and think about what's in that food as well. Probably a discussion for another day. So all 4 groups had the same systemic reaction to gluten, to the alpha gliadin protein, as did the celiacs, you know, everyone, even the people that didn't think they had any issue. So let's talk about what the signs you might be having an issue with gluten are. So they're kind of numerous to list, right? And I talked about some of the things that gluten ends up as, right? So, you know, autoimmune disease and anxiety and depression and, you know, even cancer or seizures or psoriasis or any of those things, right? So let's back it up and talk about what the signs, the early signs that gluten is affecting your health. Some of the most common symptoms are things like bloating, diarrhea, constipation. We're going to talk about BMs here, really smelly bowel movements. That's a sign something's not right. Abdominal pain, headaches or migraines. If you're tired all the time, or maybe you officially have fatigue. If you have skin problems, and it could be hair loss, it could be psoriasis, it could be chronic urticaria, which is like an itchy red rash. It could be depression. It could be brain fog. It could be, a symptom could be, you know, that you've developed anxiety or an autoimmune disease. Any of these things can be signs that gluten is affecting your health. Now, the most common symptom, when you look at all the studies across the board, the most common symptom associated with gluten troubles is just a generalized lack of wellness, meaning the body is just not functioning well overall, right? You've got all of these miscellaneous medical symptoms. Seems pretty broad, I know. But essentially, if you eat gluten and you have any kind of chronic health trouble, that is a sign that gluten is affecting your health. And so a lot of times people will ask the question, well, you know, if gluten sensitivity, if gluten thing, you know, they're so broad, the symptoms are so broad, why is that? And really it boils down to genetics, right? So gluten affects everyone differently. And we can look at what science tells us and also what we know anecdotally from patients. And so the Harvard study that I talked about in the beginning, right? All the human suits, all the people reacted the same way with intestinal permeability or leaky gut. But what happens after that is a little bit different for each person. And it depends on where, let's call it a weak link, where your particular weak link is, okay? So when the intestines become permeable, so that means food particles, partially digested food particles, rather than what the body expects, something like an amino acid or an individual molecule, can enter the bloodstream. They literally pass through the intestinal walls into the bloodstream rather than being broken down and absorbed into the bloodstream the way they should be. And since the body, specifically your immune system, doesn't recognize that substance, right? It's expecting amino acid to knock on the door, and what shows up is a partially digested piece of broccoli or bread or salami, okay? and the body doesn't recognize that substance. So it creates antibodies, memory B cells, against it, okay? And now here's where it gets a little bit different for each person. If you continue to follow the chain of what happens next after the immune system and after the inflammation begins, it happens for all humans, but it depends on where your weak link is. And that weak link, if you think about it, is, I'm using the analogy weak link, but it's really defined by your genes and your antecedents, or what you've been exposed to your entire life, mentally, physically, energetically. All of those things over a lifetime come together to determine what part of your genetics is your weak link. So for you, for some, that weak link, that gluten consumption will rise to the surface as psoriasis, right? And for your sister, it could show up as acne. And for your neighbor, it could show up as rheumatoid arthritis. And for your coworker, as a thyroid issue. And for someone else, you might know as cancer. So as you continue to consume gluten, you continue to throw gasoline on that inflammatory fire. And as a result, you increase the breakdown in whatever organ or organ system your weak link is in, okay? So what that means is, depending on your weak link, your gluten sensitivity, gluten allergy, gluten intolerance could show up, as something as small as, nagging seasonal allergies. And then if ignored, it'll continue to grow and morph until it's something, it's no longer something little and nagging, it's something big and scary. And this can happen when you're 2, you're 10, you're 22, you're 45, or even 97 years old, depending on your genetics, your exposures or your antecedents, and where your weak link is. So that begs the question, right? and the question I get all the time, well, can I have a little bit of gluten? So here's the thing, having a little bit of gluten is like being a little bit pregnant, right? You just can't. Because our culture is driven by calorie reduction, and so a lot of times when people think in terms of nutrition and diet and the fuel that they're putting in their body, they often think, they can reduce the amount of gluten, and that's just as good, because we've kind of been trained and marketed to reduce our calories, reduce our fat, reduce our carbs, reduction, 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 rather than elimination. Gluten is different. And so I have a lot of people ask me, if they can have some gluten, or they'll say like, I'm doing so good, I've given up gluten, except for Tuesday night is pizza night, or except for a beer or two each night, or except for that power bar I eat because I am just so stinking active. I'm a trainer or, whatever, and I have to have that power bar. It's the only thing that's portable. So just like you can't be a little bit pregnant, you can't have a little gluten. It can't be in your food. It can't be in your lipstick, your shampoo, your moisturizer, your supplements. Supplements are a big one, y'all. And you might think these products are safe from gluten. Like, you go buy Suave shampoo and you're like, no, it's totally fine. There's nothing in it. But likely they aren't, especially if they don't say gluten-free on the label, because believe me, if they are gluten-free, that manufacturer wants you to know, because they're probably going to charge you a little bit more for it. But you have to do your due diligence and read the labels. Now, when this information goes live on iTunes and Spotify and all those places on Friday, there will also be a download included, so you can get a list of gluten-free foods as well as gluten additives to watch out for, because just like anything, if you're buying something with a label on it, you have to really read that label, and you have to know all the other words that could mean gluten. And so I'll come back and put that link back here on this video. And so in my practice, when I see clients and patients, getting rid of gluten is a non-negotiable, because I've seen it over and over and over again. And believe me, I've tried it all the ways over the last decade plus. And you can't see what's going on in someone's body unless you clear the muddy water, and gluten muddies the water, right? And so once you clear the muddy water, then you can really pinpoint exactly what's going on with their health. But if you can't get rid of gluten, then you can't see past that inflammation. You just get constant inflammation, right? So sometimes people say, well, they can eat like a certain kind of gluten. In fact, I had someone, I don't know, maybe last month, I guess they were getting ready to go to Europe in the summer, maybe they're in Europe now, but they had decided that when they eat bread in Europe, they're not affected the same way as they are with gluten in the US. And so a lot of people will say, gluten in Europe doesn't affect me the same way, or when I travel to Australia, gluten doesn't affect me the same way. So let's talk about that for just a second before I let y'all go, right? So there's two things that caused that. One, there was a study out of Australia, also in 2015. It was a really good study, but the title was super misleading. The title said that gluten has no effect on the GI system or something like that. And so it's sort of the long way to get around the cup to get to the handle here, but the title of the study was gluten has no effect on the GI system. And so news outlets ran with that, right? Especially food manufacturers fueled the fire, put out all the news stories. A study out of Australia says that gluten doesn't affect the GI system. And here's the thing, if you actually read the study, it was poorly titled, but if you actually read the study, and if you read beyond the title, then you would be able to see that in the study, what they're talking about is when you have instant GI effects. So if you're one of those people that you eat a sandwich and instantly you're bloated, you're gassy, your tummy hurts, and maybe you have to run to the bathroom for diarrhea right after that, then that is kind of like, it's something that occurs with gluten, but is not generally the gluten itself. It's something called a FODMAP. And a FODMAP is a group of carbohydrates that only comes with gluten, right? But it's poorly digested by most people. Sometimes it's also found in beans, right? The magical fruit. And which is why beans are the magical fruit, the more you eat them, right? So when they occur in gluten-containing grains, right? And so what this study was, it was showing that the FODMAPs were what was causing the gas and bloating initially. Tara says it's not just the gluten. Right, that's what I'm saying, Tara. It's the FODMAPs, actually. It's not necessarily the way they bake it or the preservatives. It's actually something that goes with gluten. It's a carbohydrate that is part of the gluten protein. It's also found in beans. So a lot of times you'll find people that have FODMAP sensitivities. They're also sensitive to the FODMAPs in beans as well. And so if they eat a lot of beans, I see this a lot with meat eaters that try to go vegan and all of a sudden they're eating a lot of beans. Well, it's not working for them. They're having gastrointestinal issues and all this stuff. It's usually because of those FODMAPs. But the study showed that the FODMAPs are the big contributors to that immediate reaction for gluten. But long term, it's the gluten proteins that actually cause the sustained inflammation that leads to the mental health issues and the autoimmune issues and the big inflammatory scary things like cancer and so forth. So all of that to demonstrate the reason why you can go to Europe and some people that aren't sensitive to FODMAPs but are still sensitive to gluten can eat the breads in European countries is because their wheat strains are lower in FODMAPs than the US, right? So people go and think, oh wow, I had the most delicious Italian bread and I didn't have any bloating or gas, so I can eat European bread. And that's not true because it doesn't help the long-term effects of gluten. So if you guys have any questions, be sure and put them in the comment box and I will come back and answer them. But to wrap this up, bottom line, gluten isn't for humans at all. And so I want to impart on you that if you are eating gluten and you have any other health concern, physical, mental, emotional, it starts with one of my non-negotiables, getting rid of gluten. And it's really not that hard. There's lots of really good products on the market today, and it's really not that hard just to leave that out of your diet. We've been gluten-free for nearly a decade now, and we eat all the good stuff. We eat all the tasty foods, but we just don't do it with gluten, right? We choose to use things. We're actually gluten-free and dairy-free and egg-free as well, despite having chickens, right? So if you guys have any questions, put them in the box below. I'd be happy to connect any dots for you. And if not, I hope you guys have a great rest of your Wednesday. I'll put the gluten-free download as well as the additives to watch out for. Oh, I did have a question pop up on Instagram I wanted to ask. Somebody asked, why does it matter for shampoos and cosmetics and all of these things? And there are two reasons why it matters. One is the same principle that aromatherapy works by, right? Aromatherapy works because the olfactory sensors in the nerve, but essential oils work topically because it takes about 26 to 30 seconds for something you put on your skin to be present in your bloodstream. There's a really cool experiment you can do with a raw piece of garlic. You can rub it on the bottom of your foot, and in just less than a minute, you'll be able to taste the garlic in your mouth, okay? And so anything you put on your skin gets into your bloodstream. whether it is through shampoo or moisturizers or makeup or hand wash or cleaning supplies. So same thing when you're using stuff that has gluten in it, you really have to be careful for that. And the second part is that when you use shampoo, some of that, and I'm just using shampoo as an example, some of that is aerosolized. And so it actually, you inhale it, it gets in your lungs, causes more inflammation. So it's really important to just stay away from all of those things altogether. I think that was the only question I had from Instagram. So I hope everyone has an amazing rest of your Wednesday. I will be around to answer questions. Be well.